Hi, and welcome to this session, Azure SQL What to Use When. This is being recorded as part of SQL Saturday Los Angeles, so I'm very grateful to the past community and the Los Angeles community for allowing me to come and speak at this event. My name is Anna Hoffman, and I'm a data and appliance scientist / PM. You know, we all wear many hats in the jobs that we do every day, but I work at Microsoft on the Azure SQL team. And I really wanted to talk about what to use when, specifically kind of what are all the different deployment options that you get when you move to Azure. A lot of people tend to be overwhelmed because there are a lot of choices that you have to make. And my goal is by the end of this session, you don't see those options as confusing or overwhelming or a negative thing, but rather you see these options as a positive thing in that we're working and evolving and innovating to give you exactly what you need when you need it and really not making you pay for anything more than that. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, and I've got a few demos prepared, which hopefully run smoothly. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I like to start by just giving a very brief overview of the history of Azure SQL. So on the left, you see a guy named Ray Ozzie at the PDC conference in 2008. So that's the Professional Developers Conference. It no longer takes place. It's very similar to the Microsoft build that you would see today. But Ray Ozzie was our chief architect at the time, and he came on stage and he announced this Windows Azure Services platform. And what you see here that I like to call out is SQL Services from the beginning of Azure was really literally front and center. And I found this other blog post from 2010, I think, and this was the what to use when for Azure SQL Database. And you don't need to read this whole thing, but basically it says you do not need to provision hardware for, install, or patch Azure SQL Database. Microsoft maintains that platform for you. You do not need to architect a database installation for scalability, high availability, or disaster recovery. Now, I still think this is a pretty good explanation of why people want to use things like Azure SQL Database. Now, over the years, we've come a long way as an Azure SQL type of family. And one thing you'll note that I always think is funny, Microsoft is infamous for doing this sort of thing, is many name changes around the time. So we had Cloud DB, SQL Data Services, SQL Azure, Azure SQL Database, this idea of V12, which we won't get into today, and then a whole bunch of different deployment options, which we've since branded one more level and kind of rolled up this whole family of Azure SQL. So there's one more bullet on here for 2020 that really I should add. So I wanted to start by just giving you an overview, and then we'll dive into each of these deployment options. Now, the first thing you want to think about from a deployment option is going to be infrastructure as a service. So this is still very much SQL Server. You just get SQL Server installed on an Azure virtual machine. So basically what this means is you no longer have to worry about the infrastructure or the host, but you still have to, but you also still have access to the OS as well as the SQL Server, which means you can get the exact version that you need, but you also need to manage your updates. Now, if we abstract away, so if we move one level further and say, you know what, I don't really need to manage the virtual machine, I just want a SQL Server. Now, this is where you enter our platform as a service types of offerings. There's two. And the first one is Azure SQL Managed Instance. And this really allows you to get a SQL Server that's managed in the cloud. And finally, if you say, I don't really need to manage a SQL Server, I just want a database, or I want databases and I want to get going, then Azure SQL Database is kind of our flagship product, the one that was there from the beginning that you can use for those sort of things. And we'll talk about some of the innovations that are happening and have happened in Azure SQL Database. So let's start by diving into SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. So I like this, we provide the promise of the cloud while maintaining OS and control. So we see a lot of customers moving to this for various reasons, just to name a few reasons. They could be reaching end of support, or they already reached it for SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2. they might want to migrate to the cloud really fast, but they have some dependencies related to the OS. For example, we see many customers that run third-party applications that need to be able to access that OS. And in order to move off of that platform or to kind of evolve to a platform as a service type of offering would take a lot of work, which really they're just trying to get to the cloud as fast as possible. Azure Virtual Machines can be a great option for this because you can get the exact OS and SQL Server version that you need. You have complete compatibility because it's just SQL Server and it's just, whether it's Windows or Linux or even containers. So you get everything really. And in addition to that, because you came to Azure, we're going to give you things like free security updates for a few more years. You can configure automatic backups and security updates, and a few other things that are available for you. And one customer story I really like for this is Allscripts. And they're basically they were able to move about 600 VMs to Azure using a technology called Azure Site Recovery. Basically fail over 600 VMs in I think 2 weeks. And then they were up and running and they had moved to the cloud. Now the interesting thing about them is that once they moved, they started to evaluate the platform as a service offerings and eventually started moving some workloads to Azure SQL Managed Instance. So they're a great example of a customer who took a phased approach to migrating to the cloud. Now, I'm not going to touch on all of these details today. I'll share lots of resources for you at the end. But one thing I wanted to call out is that there are 2 ways that you can get SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. Now, when we're dealing with SQL people, which hopefully most of you viewers are probably SQL people, what we find is a lot of folks tend to go and deploy the virtual machine that they want, and then, just like you would anywhere else, install SQL Server. Now, this is great, but up until recently, if you just self-installed, that's what we call it, self-installed on an Azure virtual machine, you're not going to get a lot of the benefits that we've been working on for SQL Server on specifically Azure virtual machines. Now, recently we enabled this thing called Resource Provider. So by enabling this little agent on your self-installed Azure virtual machine, you can start to take advantage of all the things that we're doing here, including things like advanced data security, previously only available in PaaS services, but now available in Azure virtual machines. And this is going to give you some things like advanced threat protection, which is just an awesome technology that really helps you monitor and get alerts around the security of your database or server. And so that's a self-installed SQL Server on Azure virtual machine. The other way is you can just go to our marketplace, and I'll show this very much at the end, and pick the OS and SQL Server version that you need, as well as the licensing option. So we have these pre-installed images where you basically just go deploy the VM and SQL Server is already installed. So with that, you automatically get this resource provider capability. So I just want to call that out. If you are self-installing, make sure you set up resource provider. All right, so now we're going to move from talking about IaaS, like a virtual machine, to PaaS, so managed instance or single database. And really, you see a lot of things up here. And the main thing to highlight is that with infrastructure as a service, a lot of these things are possible and configurable. However, with a platform as a service, a lot of these things you just get out the gate and you don't have to configure. For example, with Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, you just get an SLA. And you can change your service tier and get a higher SLA. And you can do things like multi-zone deployment, so you can even increase your availability within a specific region. So those are things that you can do within a few clicks, right? Another example is geo-replication or advanced data security. Like I mentioned, this is now available in preview for IaaS, but it involves setting up the agent, setting up log analytics, connecting these things together, and kind of making sure that all the pieces can talk effectively. With a PaaS service, they can kind of talk effectively already. Now, the big difference really is this idea of versionless. So with IaaS, you get a specific OS and a specific SQL Server. So you're still going to have to go through the upgrading and patching exercises that you probably do on a regular basis today. Now, when you move to a PaaS service, you no longer have to do that. The onus becomes on us to update and patch you as needed, as well as to not break you when those things happen. So this can be a huge, weight off many people's shoulders. And just allow you to focus on doing what you want with your data and getting the latest and greatest innovations from Azure. All right, so let's talk about a PaaS service. This first one is Azure SQL MI, or Managed Instance. Now, why we came up with this and why we built this product is because a lot of people wanted to move to a PaaS service like Azure SQL Database. However, they needed some instance scoped features. Now, when I say instance scoped features, I mean things like service broker, database mail, SQL Server agent, CLR, those sorts of capabilities that you don't get in Azure SQL Database because you just get a database. We're able to bring those to Managed Instance because you kind of get more of the surface area of SQL Server. We also have the ability to give you native virtual network support, so you can deploy your managed instance completely alone, isolated in a subnet within a network of your choosing. And it is a fully managed service. So you're going to get all those PaaS capabilities that I just spoke about. Now, one customer I like to mention here is a customer called Komatsu. And I like this customer because they self-reported these numbers like they migrated very easily, and then they saw a 49% cost reduction and a 25 to 30% increase in performance. So those are pretty big, significant cost reduction and performance enhancements. So definitely something to consider if you're looking for, the best of SQL Server and the best of Azure as a one managed service. That will be Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, I talked a little bit about PaaS, and I want to kind of, hone in on this idea of the power of PaaS. Now, you're probably familiar with ideas of geo-replication, basically having readables in other regions around the globe, and then the idea of auto failover groups. So you set up a failover group so that in the event of an emergency, you can fail over to another region. Now, this is what I call the power of PaaS because this is something that historically has been very complicated, very time-consuming to set up, but with Azure and with Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, we make it much easier. Now, additionally, you'll see some changes here, and I tried to highlight the good things in blue. So there are some differences between geo-replication and auto failover groups. Auto failover groups, as the name suggests, can auto fail you over if needed, and you don't have to update the connection strings after a failover occurs. Geo-replication, however, cannot automatically fail you over, and you would have to update your connection string, but you can have multiple geo-replicated databases and servers throughout the world, including in the same region as your existing server. So that's a benefit there. And so you'll see there's a few things that are here that might lean you towards choosing geo-replication versus auto failover groups. The other thing I'll call out is that auto failover groups today is available in SQL Database and Managed Instance, but geo-replication is only available in SQL Database. So with Managed Instance, you have less of a choice. Just wanted to call that out. Now with that, I want to show you an example of this power of PaaS. So let me switch over to my virtual machine. So here I'm running an Azure virtual machine, and I have a lot of stuff going on. So give me a moment and I will explain to you what is happening. Now, if you first focus on the left side of your screen, what I have is Azure Data Studio, which is an awesome tool that you can use for SQL Server and Azure SQL. I'm a big fan, but I love this capability called notebooks. Now, there are PowerShell notebooks like you see here, but there are also SQL notebooks and all types of different languages for notebooks. Really awesome technology, really big fan, because you can mix runnable code with text, and then you can save the results and send it off for reporting. So what we've done here, you see we're at step 7. I'm not going to go through all 6 steps today, but basically it only took me 6 PowerShell commands to create a failover group in another region and get it up and running and getting my databases on it and all that stuff. So it was very easy to get up and running. Now, what we're going to do in this is we're going to take a look at the assignment of the roles. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying get the Azure SQL Database failover group, and I've just gone ahead and stored these variables as names as variables for my resource group, and the DR server. So in this case, I called the East US2, I believe, region server, the DR server, or disaster recovery server. And the other one is just my regular server. And then I'm selecting the replication role. So what you can see is that my DR server is currently running as a secondary. So again, this means I don't have to change any connection strings. Just when I hit the connection of, the name of my failover group .secondary.database.windows.net, I'm going to be connected to the readable secondary. Now, what's happening on the right over here is that we're trying to connect to the primary and do an insert, and then we're trying to connect from the secondary and read that line that we just inserted. And we're just reporting if it was successful or not. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use the switch command to initiate a failover. So I go ahead and kick that off. You'll notice I say server name DR server, so I basically want to make that DR server the primary because it used to be the secondary. Now what you're seeing over here is that the inserts and the reads are failing as this change is occurring. So behind the scenes, we're changing the connection strings for you. You just point to the failover group primary or secondary, and we take care of the rest. So this means no change in connection strings for you. It also means that retry logic is very important. When you move to the cloud, you want to make sure that in the event that something happens or you hit a blip, that you don't go down. So having retry logic is essential here. Now I can then check the status of that secondary DR server again and see it's now in the primary role. And when I'm ready, I can kind of fail back and again, hopefully you're seeing here how simple and how manageable this process is. And we'll see again, it will momentarily become unavailable and then it'll go back to being successful. So that was just a glimpse at the power of PaaS in Managed Instance and SQL Database with something like auto failover groups. All right, let me switch back to my slides. And all of the demos that you see today, I'm going to share resources so that you can actually go and try these out yourself. All right, so the next service is Azure SQL Database, and we say this is built for modern cloud apps, and we see customers moving to this for a myriad of reasons. Some reasons could be that they need more than 8 terabytes of storage for their database, or they have even bigger databases than that, and they don't want to be restricted by size of data operations. They could be looking for multi-tenanted solutions so they can run a bunch of databases in an optimized and easy to manage way. They might be looking for something like serverless, which we'll talk a little more about later, or some of the many other capabilities that come within Azure SQL Database. Azure SQL Database is also going to get you the highest SLA. I mentioned SLA earlier. With Azure SQL Database and availability zones, you can get 99.995% of uptime. And I did the math with Bob and Emily the other day, and I can't remember exactly, but I think it was around that worked out to be 30 minutes a year or something of downtime overall. Now, one customer I really like is a customer called, let me pause that for my dog. Now, one customer that I really like is AccuWeather because they really just wanted a database and they wanted to be able to hook into other services. So for example, they wanted to get up and running with tools like Azure Data Factory and Azure Machine Learning Services so they could start building intelligent applications. And one part of the intelligence and the power of PaaS that you only get in Azure SQL Database, and that's because we really have access to more of the telemetry behind the scenes, is automatic tuning. So this is a really awesome capability, and I just thought I would show it to you all. Let's go back to the demo. I'm going to cancel this and take you to the portal. So what we're seeing here is my Azure SQL Database. It's called Workload Insights Demo. And if I scroll down on the left, under Intelligent Performance, I can see the Performance Overview. So this is going to give me a dashboard of a few things, right? I'm going to be able to look into query performance insights, so I can actually click into any of these queries and see more information about them and dive into this dashboard. What you're also seeing is some tuning activity and if I've set up automatic tuning, as well as some recommendations. If I go into recommendations, what I'm seeing here are a few things. One, I'm seeing some create index recommendations and some drop index recommendations and a parameterized query. I can also see the suggested impact if those indexes are implemented. So then what I can do is I can click in, for example, I see there are 2 create indexes. I'm just going to click into one and I can see information about what it is and what it wants to do. And I have 2 options. I can click the create index, and basically this is going to tell me what the query is that I need to run in order to create that index. And the other thing that I can do is select apply. Now, here comes some new options, right? So it says it's going to start the process to create the recommended index and validate it after creation. And it says, do you want to continue? So we do want to continue. We want to go ahead and say, yeah, apply this index. And then we're also going to check this automatically apply create index in the future. So this means if the service ever finds an index that they think should be created, we've given it permission to just go ahead and create it. So this automatic indexing type of capability. Now I'm hit OK, and what you're going to see immediately is both create indexes go into this pending state. And the reason for that is because I said automatically apply in the future, so that's why not just one moved. But you also see they say pending and they don't say success. Now the reason for this is Azure SQL Database is going to wait till a period of known low utilization. So it's not going to interfere with your workload. And then it's going to apply the index, create the index, and then it's going to monitor and validate and make sure it actually did have the performance impact that it thought it would have. And if it does, great, but if it doesn't, it will actually revert the changes that it's made and bring you back to the state you were before. So this really can take, again, a lot of pressure off of you, and just kind of, especially if you're managing a lot of databases, this can be a really useful technology. And really behind the scenes, it's leveraging machine learning to try to identify your workload and identify indexes or queries that could be improved by dropping or creating an index. So hopefully that was a cool look at automatic tuning. Now I'm going to go back to the slides. So now we've talked about Azure SQL Managed Instance, we talked about Azure SQL Database, and we're going to kind of drill into both of these offerings further, the PaaS offerings. 2 things I didn't really mention: in both offerings we have this idea of a pool. And there's 2 types of pools. For example, you could have an instance pool. Now, why would you want this? Azure SQL Managed Instance takes a long time to deploy. That's just kind of known because of what we're doing in the backend. We're essentially deploying a whole ring for you. It's something we're working on, but for now, it does take a few hours to deploy this thing. So one benefit or reason for instance pools is that you could basically pre-deploy a pool. So it takes a long time initially, but then you could deploy managed instances, multiple managed instances into it without that long time delay. And also in an instance pool, you can have smaller instances than what's allowed in a normal single instance. So this can help you migrate smoothly and kind of migrate your smaller workloads, but multiple of them, to Azure SQL Managed Instance in the most cost-effective way. Now this is in public preview today. On the other hand, we've had elastic pools in Azure SQL DB for many years, and basically this is great for multi-tenant applications, and it allows you to resource share and cost optimize over all your databases within a pool. So this can be really powerful for managing performance as well as for cost optimization. Now, once you've seen all the deployment options, and let's say you pick one, the next thing you have to do is select a service tier. Now in Managed Instance, the story is pretty easy because you only have 2 options. You have general purpose and you have business critical. And as the name suggests, most of our customers are running just fine on general purpose. However, if you need, low latency, fast recovery, or a readable secondary right off the bat, then business critical might be something you want to choose. Now, this is based on the vCore model. In the Azure SQL Database, there's another model for purchasing, but in this one, it's just vCore, so that's easy for you to decide. And additionally, I just wanted to kind of compare these two things. So in general purpose, think of it kind of like a failover cluster instance. So your data files are actually stored in remote storage in this case. In business critical, you basically get an always on availability group behind the scenes and everything is running on local storage. Now, if you look at I/O per second, or something we refer to as IOPS, you're going to get better IOPS in business critical. But with better IOPS and things like this readable secondary, which you see with the R in the bottom right, and the ability to do in-memory OLTP type of workloads, there is a cost. So you see my Yelp-like cost comparison there as well. Now, if we go back here and say, okay, so we looked at service tiers for managed instance and the possibilities there, but what about for Azure SQL Database? Now, for Azure SQL Database, I briefly mentioned this earlier, there are two what we refer to as purchasing models, the DTU model and the vCore model. Now, the DTU model came along first, and the idea here was basically to make it easy for you to choose, and you just kind of get a bundle of compute and storage, and you can scale as you need to scale, right? What happened over time is that, we said, okay, it's a little bit inflexible, and many customers want to be able to scale their storage and compute independently. So that's what happened with the vCore model. And the vCore model is recommended because it also unlocks new things that can help you save costs. One is Azure Hybrid Benefit. So if you have existing licenses, you can get a significant discount on your price of your Azure SQL Database. Additionally, reserved capacity or reserved instances, which is basically saying, hey, I'm going to prepay for this database for X amount of time, but because I'm prepaying, I'm going to get a significant discount. So that's, some of the things you also get from vCore model, apart from flexibility, is more pricing, discounting opportunities. So that would be our recommendation. So because of that, I'm going to focus on the service tiers there. So again, just like managed instance, you have general purpose, which is going to be best for most of our customers are running on general purpose today. Then you have business critical if it's needed. And these comparisons are the same. The architectures is very similar to a managed instance from an availability standpoint. The only thing that's an exception is you see this serverless over here on the bottom left, and this is not available in Azure SQL Managed Instance. Please note that. But what serverless is let's take a look at a scenario. Let's say we have a bank, and this bank has a line of business expense reporting application. Now, people only ever do their expenses during business hours. So let's say they don't do them late at night on the 31st of the month. But let's say they use it during business hours, but during the end of the month, and especially after a big conference, maybe an internal conference, they have a lot more of expenses and they're doing them a lot more at the end of the month. So their application needs to be able to handle this unpredictable and intermittent workloads where, at night, no one's really hitting the database, but then sometimes, like at the end of the month, they see spikes in performance, and they want to be able to not have to choose between over provisioning and overpaying versus under provisioning and underperforming. They want kind of to be able to auto scale as needed. And that's what serverless is going to allow customers to do, because in this scenario, let's say everyone goes home, no one hits the application for 2 hours. If I set a 2-hour delay on my Azure SQL Database, then what happens if no one hits it in 2 hours, it actually shuts off. And we separate the compute from the storage entirely, and we basically take away the compute. So at that time, you're only paying for the storage. Now, the next morning when Bob comes in and he tries to log into the application, it will fail initially and take, about 30 seconds or a minute to spin back up. We're reattaching the compute, restarting SQL Server. One thing to note here is you are going to get a cold cache in this case. So there will be kind of a warm-up period, but if you're willing to kind of do that and your workload allows that, then it's really going to allow you to cut costs. And on the other side, what it does is you specify the minimum and maximum vCores. So say 1 to 16 vCores or 2 to 16 vCores. And what we're going to do is scale on a per second basis for the exact max of CPU or memory that you need at that moment. So really powerful technology, really great opportunity to kind of save costs as well as increase your desired performance output. So that's serverless. Now the other, interesting thing that is not available in Azure SQL Managed Instance yet is Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Now this is basically, we re-architected Azure SQL Database, SQL Server, we took things apart, we took the log service out, we implemented a cache layering system, and basically are able to scale as big as you need to. So we say unlimited storage. I think technically we support up to 100 terabytes of data, but that's really just because that's as high as we've been able to test to. But what you can see here, and actually that should be 2 money signs, the cost is somewhere between general purpose and business critical, as well as the I/O per second. And because of this caching system, we won't get into today, but there's some really interesting talks on this. Actually, as part of this SQL Saturday, Denzel Rivero does a deep dive on Hyperscale. So if you watch this video and are thinking, oh, I want to learn more about Hyperscale, you have that on the channel you're on right now. And the other thing you see with Hyperscale is you can have between 0 and 4 readable secondaries. So unlike business critical, where you have 3 secondaries, but you can only read from one of them, in Hyperscale, you can choose how many secondaries you want. And this is going to affect your availability as well as, how many reads that you want. And you can have up to 4. So that's pretty great read scale from Hyperscale. And one of the other great things about Hyperscale, and then I'll move on, is that we've really managed to kind of conquer these size of data operations. So whether you're scaling a really big database up or down or that sort of thing, we can do it in constant time, which means it's just going to take a few minutes regardless of how much data it is, regardless of how much you're scaling. So that's a little bit different from general purpose and business critical, as well as managed instance, but a very powerful technology when you're talking about, like a 70 terabyte database. Now, since we talked, primarily about business critical and general purpose in Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, I wanted to show you kind of how the difference between the failover cluster instance, which you kind of get with general purpose, works compared to the always on availability group, which you get behind the scenes with business critical. And just again to note, like for this situation, you're not having to configure anything. This is just what you get by selecting general purpose versus business critical. And again, I'll share resources on how to do this. So if you just bear with me for one moment as I set up this demo, and then I will explain everything. So I'm going to just rearrange my screen. Just stay with me. And again, I'm going to be using Azure Data Studio. I'm a big Azure Data Studio fan, as you'll learn if you watch other videos by me or other things that I do. So what I'm going to do is first I'm just going to make sure I'm still connected in both of these notebooks. So you'll notice I have 2 notebooks, and what I'm doing is on the left screen. So everything you see on the left side of the screen is related to a general purpose database. So I put that in the output here. And everything on the right side is related to a business critical database. So you'll see the BC over here. And what I'm using is this wonderful tool called OSHS. Bob Ward, you've probably all heard of him. He introduced me to this tool about a year ago, and since then I started playing with it, and now I've just seen it's a really powerful open source tool for just kind of like simulating workloads. So let me kick off the business critical one. So I'm just running that down here in PowerShell, and you'll see the results of this command, which is basically selecting the count from a table. is just being returned. So it's just doing that 50,000 times is what I set it up to do. And this is just to simulate hitting an application, right? And are we successfully able to hit an application? Now, same thing over here with general purpose. I'm running the exact same query, but this time on a general purpose database. So again, left general purpose, right business critical. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this handy PowerShell command, invoke Azure SQL Database failover, so we can kind of compare how long each failover takes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play, and I want you all to watch what happens down here. All right, hopefully this goes well. So I've kicked these both off, and almost immediately you see the business critical database becomes unavailable as this failover occurs, and then it's already back up and running before I can explain what's even happening. And the general purpose one is taking a little bit longer. So business critical will take, and you'll see this command even completed, but business critical will take just a matter of seconds, because what's happening behind the scenes is you have an always on availability group. So we're simply just redirecting you from your primary to one of your secondaries, and then we can get you connected as we spin up another secondary. Now with general purpose, you see we're back and running in about 30 seconds, and that's because it's kind of like a failover cluster instance. So we're trying to look for spare capacity, and then we're moving you over and failing you over. So both of these are really fantastic setup that you get just right off the bat. Even the general purpose, to be able to fail over in the case of an emergency or something bad happens or whatever in 30 seconds is pretty powerful. And with business critical, even more so. So this is a cool example. I enjoy it. I think it's kind of exciting and cool to kind of see how this actually works underneath. And again, you're going to have access to all this, so you'll be able to see it later and try it for yourself. So I'm going to stop those workloads now and head back to my slides. All right, so we talked about a lot. There's one more choice. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But I felt like I needed to call it out because I did say what to use when. One thing you can pick is the hardware. And you'll notice in the past few years, I would say the most common hardware choices have been Gen 4 and Gen 5. You no longer see Gen 4 on this page because we're in the process of kind of phasing it out this year. I think we announced a deprecation sometime in July. And so what that means is, you'll move towards a Gen 5 or even some sort of future generation. Now, really, my call out here is that, hardware is evolving. Hardware is changing. It's getting better. It's getting faster. You can now have more memory, more cores. There's a lot of enhancements happening. And so the reason you'll see these hardware options change is because we want to keep you running on, the latest innovations that have happened in hardware. So, for example, we have two hardware in preview right now. You can see the details on the right, and you can expect that more Gen 6, Gen 7, they might not be called like that, but more generations of hardware will come as it becomes available. So again, this is a good thing, not an overwhelming choice thing. All right, so if we back up and we look at all the things we've talked about today, it's a lot of different options. But hopefully, if you're kind of looking at this as I'm talking, you're seeing that, okay, so like I kind of get this general purpose thing, or I kind of get, single database, I'm going to get just a database. Whereas, with something like serverless, I'm getting just a database, but I can kind of pause and you see the recommended workload up here. So this is kind of an interesting visual that was actually given to me. I didn't create this, but I think it's very interesting. It's kind of, it's a lot of information, but now that you've kind of heard about all of this, you're hearing more information, and hopefully this is making a little bit more sense. Now, I don't want to forget about this idea of SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine. Remember, this is just SQL Server running on an OS that you select, a SQL Server version that you select, but with that comes the responsibility of patching and updating and upgrading. Now I have one more thing to show you. I have mentioned how we've kind of been rebranding this Azure SQL family. So how are we implementing this in the portal to make it easier for you? Now I just am home on my database and in my Azure portal, and what you see here is I actually have an Azure SQL blade. So you recall we used to just have a SQL Databases blade, but now we also have an Azure SQL blade. And if I select that blade, what's going to happen is, let's just look at one subscription. What's going to happen is I'm going to see all of the resources related to SQL. So whether they're SQL Server VM, I didn't apply that. Let's see this. There we go. So whether it's a SQL Server VM or an Azure SQL Database logical server or a managed instance, you're going to be able to have one pane of glass to look at your various Azure SQL deployments. So that's one awesome thing that we're doing. Now, another thing that we're doing is we've added this unified create. So you come in, this looks very similar to maybe the first slide of this presentation, but basically we're giving you a what to use when right in the portal. So if you're not sure, you can click on it. So I click on single databases and I can see some of the reasons why I might go about creating one of these things. And perhaps if you recall at the beginning, we talked about self-installing SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine versus selecting an image from the marketplace. This is the place where you can do that. And before this blade, it was very hard to find the image that you want. But now this makes it so much easier. So I can search in here, for bring your own license type of images. I can also see there are things for different version of Windows Server as well as Linux, so RHEL, Ubuntu, SUSE, SLES. So you can kind of pick exactly what you need all the way down to SQL Server 2008 R2 SP3 on Windows Server 2008 R2. So again, this is just one more way that we're making it easier. We're trying to make it easier for you to kind of get exactly what you need in a way that makes sense and isn't super confusing. So hopefully, if you walk away from this and know nothing, at least you are aware of something new in the portal. That's pretty cool. And yeah. So in summary, I love this phrase, but it always makes me laugh. Bob Ward and I have been working a lot on Azure SQL these days. We created a big workshop. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But Bob has said Azure SQL has evolved into the world's database. And I love it. And we're going to keep pushing that. And so I hope you all have kind of seen how we're really trying to push and innovate and work towards being the best database, because we're already the best engine by a statement there. Yeah, and we talked about VMs, we talked about MI, we talked about single DB, and the power of PaaS with things like auto failover groups and geo-replication and automatic indexing in Azure SQL Database. There's a lot of stuff here, but all good things. So hopefully this has been a useful session for you all. Of course, I have to share resources. Bunch of resources that are available for you. The first is aka.ms/SQL workshops. This is going to have workshops available for all topics related to SQL Server and Azure SQL. Myself, Bob Ward, Buck Whitty, we spend a lot of time making sure stuff here is good, syncing with the product groups, our team really, to make sure that we're getting the latest and greatest stuff out there in a way that makes sense. Specifically, this is from the Azure SQL workshop. So if you go to that link and then select the Azure SQL workshop, you're going to find lots more content related to this, including labs and demos on how to do all the demos I did today, and then a bunch more, especially related to security and performance that we didn't see today. There's also this Choose Azure SQL tool, which is a new thing we launched as part of the Azure SQL family rebranding launch. And the documentation is always awesome. And I also had to give a shameless plug to Data Expose. Data Expose is a series on Microsoft Developer that I host, and it's a really fun series. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we release new videos related to Azure SQL and SQL Server and other things in the Azure Data Platform at Microsoft. They're really short videos. They're a lot of fun. They're with the program managers and engineers. We go deep, but we also go high level. So I encourage you to kind of go out and subscribe to that show or the channel, and hope to see you in the future on comments at events when we eventually go to moving towards events in person. I am actually located in Los Angeles, so I would love to meet all of you from the Los Angeles area. that, I want to say thank you. I know taking time out of Saturday to learn about SQL isn't always the most exciting thing, but you chose to do it. And if you're watching this on YouTube later, you chose to spend time listening to me and learning about Azure SQL. So I hope it was useful time for you. I really appreciate it. And if you need anything, I encourage you to use our hashtags or follow us on Twitter. You can also reach out directly to me on Twitter either via mention or a message if you have questions, or on LinkedIn as well, and we'll put a link to some of these resources in the description. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.